Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Dr. Carlee Purdum. I'm a research professor at Texas A&M University for the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. Thank you for inviting me to testify today and present information about a recently published report that I have previously submitted electronically to your Appropriations Committee staff. Let me begin with a statement, which is more of a common observation for anyone who has spent time in Texas, especially lately. Throughout the history of imprisonment in Texas, it has been documented that incarcerated people and prison staff have experienced harm from extreme weather conditions and at times a lack of adequate protections. Although 87% of households in the U.S. use air conditioning equipment today, only approximately 30% of Texas prison units are fully air conditioned. According to a 2014 report from the Human Rights Clinic of the University of Texas School of Law, temperatures inside units consistently exceed 90 degrees, and at least one unit has been shown to have topped 149 degrees on the heat index. Conditions of high humidity in Texas prisons have also contributed to adverse health impacts from heat. The number of incarcerated people who have fallen ill or died from exposure to extreme temperatures throughout the state's history is unknown, yet notable clusters of heat-related deaths and illnesses have occurred. At least 23 documented heat-related deaths of incarcerated people have been recorded by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice since 1998. In 2018 alone, at least 79 incarcerated people and prison staff members reported heat-related illnesses between January and October. Without air conditioning throughout all units, TDCJ policies primarily prioritize mitigating the impact of extreme temperatures by getting resources to incarcerated people individually. Aside from the limited access to cooled beds or air-conditioned housing areas, these policies include providing drinking water, ice used to cool water temperature, additional cooled showers when possible, fans, and access to cooled respite areas. According to TDCJ, the agency's policies are meant to provide sufficient heat mitigation efforts for incarcerated persons in units without air conditioning. However, TDCJ has also noted in 2019 that in practice, implementing this strategy is difficult and that mitigating the risk of heat impacts across the state's now 101 units, which have approximately 120,000 incarcerated persons with varying medical vulnerabilities and security characteristics, presents a unique challenge and requires a comprehensive system-wide approach. Despite the current heat mitigation policies, nearly every year there are reports of incarcerated persons and staff falling very ill and or dying from complications from extreme heat in Texas prisons. The report I have submitted to the committee details an analysis of 309 surveys from incarcerated persons that were collected by the Texas Prisons Community Advocates, or TPCA, through citizen science efforts between 2018 and 2020. The surveys developed by TPCA asked incarcerated persons to describe their experiences with heat illness based upon these heat mitigation policies currently in place with TDCJ. The report primarily focuses on access to water and ice, additional showers, cooled respite areas, and commissary items. In analyzing these surveys, we identified consistent patterns of challenging experiences with heat mitigation policies across units. These patterns were also supported by previous news reporting, published research articles and reports, and other documentary evidence. These challenges stem, as TDCJ noted before, in the difficulties of getting heat mitigating resources to 120,000 people, not including prison staff, individually, every single day when the heat mitigation policies go into effect. Some key findings from the report include heat in Texas prisons is degrading incarcerated people's mental and physical health and exacerbating pre-existing conditions. The true impact of heat on the number of deaths of incarcerated persons, as well as prison health costs, has not been truly assessed, but it is significant. In 2019, the state spent over $750 million on prison health care, a 53% increase from 7 years earlier, when that cost was less than $500 million. These costs can be expected to increase over time as the incarcerated population becomes more vulnerable with each year over time as they are exposed to extreme heat. This will also increase the healthcare burden in communities across Texas to which incarcerated persons may return upon release. Overall, participants described a strong sense of fear and mistrust of the prison system to protect them from heat-related illness and death. This kind of mistrust can lead to destabilization within units and increased violence, which can also lead to costly lawsuits. Participants described not having adequate access to resources, including water, ice, showers, and access to cooled respite areas. Units rely on water coolers in common areas to dispense water to incarcerated people, but they frequently run out due to demand. It is a burden on staff to continuously fill and clean them, not to mention fetching ice to keep the water cooled. Reports of dirty coolers with bugs or vermin inside them were common, and participants described fear of drinking the water, which could also lead to heat-related illness. Participants frequently described being denied access to showers and cooled respite areas due to staff being overwhelmed with constant demand, limited space and resources, and broken infrastructure. Current policies emphasize certain infrastructure in prisons, including fans, blowers, ice machines, water coolers, showers, and respite areas. The extreme demand on these infrastructure leads to degradation over time, which are costly to replace. Extreme heat has also been shown to degrade and compromise building and material infrastructure as well. Participants described the constant back and forth with prison staff over getting water coolers cleaned and refilled, ice for the water, additional showers, and access to cooled respite areas, while in the context of extreme heat, also creates significant tension, especially as staff are already overworked and overwhelmed with their security-related responsibilities, and incarcerated persons are fearful of heat-related illness and death. Tension, mistrust, and incidents of violence in prison systems has a traumatic and chilling effect on staff retention and recruitment, which can be extremely costly to the system. These are just a few of the findings from our report, which I hope you will thoroughly examine. The lack of air conditioning in prisons across Texas has been argued to be in violation of human rights, the U.S. Constitution's 8th Amendment to protection against cruel and unusual punishment, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection to citizens, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act and Rehabilitation Act. Extreme heat disproportionately impacts incarcerated people with medical and mental health vulnerabilities, but can also create them in previously healthy persons. Such vulnerabilities are overrepresented in prison systems across the U.S. and in Texas. This issue is only going to continue to worsen with increasing annual temperatures and an increasing number of days over 100 degrees in Texas. The lack of cooling in prisons will continue to exacerbate the degradation of health for both incarcerated people and staff. To continue to attempt to mitigate the risk of heat illness by getting resources to individuals is like attempting to mitigate flood risk by only passing out sandbags. The pressure on prison staff to be responsible for the lives and safety of incarcerated people, their fellow officers, as well as their own selves in a hazardous heated environment has been shown to increase staff turnover and negatively impact recruitment. Lawsuits against the state may continue and grow in number, not only related to death and illness from extreme temperatures, but also from incidents of violence within prisons that could be mitigated by implementing cooling throughout the system. In conclusion, implementing system-wide structural mitigation by adding air conditioning to units will reduce costs related to heat hazards by reducing costly damage to infrastructure, reducing physical and mental health-related costs for incarcerated persons, reduce funds used to fend off lawsuits to the state from both heat-related illness and death, but also from other potential violence, and reduce costs of overtime and costs for recruiting and training a constant flow of new staff. Investing in true hazard mitigation efforts that mitigate the intensity of heat and not just the symptoms of heat exposure will make incarcerated people and those that work in prisons safer. I thank the committee for your consideration and time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you. Representative Sherman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your service to our country, sir. The information that you have both provided is very compelling, very thought-provoking, and hopefully it inspires some action from our legislative body. You talk about the impact on those who work in our system as well, and that's certainly important, and it's the reason that I've advocated for a study on the impact on correctional officers who work in our system. And that was due to a gentleman named Reginald Moore out of Houston, Texas, who passed away about 2 or 3 years ago. He was the one who disclosed Sugarland 95, which was a cemetery that was built in Imperial, I think it is, cemetery there in Sugarland. You mentioned that sometimes the threat of an officer getting written up for asking to go to the restroom or respite, do you think that that's also a threat to those who are serving time, that are incarcerated? Because I know you mentioned that they have rights, but if that's happening to the employees, which you've acknowledged, what do you think the chances are it happening to those who are incarcerated?
So they don't get written up if they request respite. If they get a heat-related illness, injury, that's when the write-up comes. I have a hearing that I have to represent a staff member coming up. She said she needed respite. They never gave her no respite. She continued to work. Exhaustion set in. She almost fell out. They wrote her up for inattention to duty. In reality, staff seen her fall, and the inmate came and grabbed her and poured water on her until staff came and held her up. So yes, they see that. I've worked in those conditions, and I know it troubles me to hear them, but I just wait till I get in writing, and, you know, it's a reality.
Yeah. And you're here to advocate for them, and we are concerned about them, and that's why we supported a 15% increase in pay.
And they're happy about that.
And we are too. We wish we could do more. But I want to go back to just the whole thing of written up. If that threat is among the workforce, and I have visited many of our units.
Yes, sir.
And spent hours in those units, in the heat, in a suit. And, you know, just as you're speaking for them, I have seen letters that have documented, according to the person who is subject to this, saying that they have been written up because they asked for a respite too.
I'm not in a position to really speak on what the inmates, because I haven't worked inside the prison since I retired in 2019. But I would not doubt it, because it's believable. But it does send a chilling effect. If that officer's working in that cell block with you 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and that officer's making sure you get to go where you need to go and do what you need to do, and making sure you got everything that's coming to you, inmate's not going to treat that officer bad, because that inmate knows when so-and-so's working, everything's going to be taken care of. So if they see something happen to an officer, yes, of course they're going to be like, well, if they do it to them, what do you think they're going to do to me? But I haven't had that reported to me, because only the staff tell me what's going on. So I don't want to send the wrong message.
Yes.
But what you're saying is very conceivable, because they do watch everything that goes on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Dr. Purdum?
I can say in getting surveys from incarcerated people, it was a common experience for them to have negative interactions with staff regarding heat mitigation policies that may lead to a write-up or case. For example, water coolers. If their water coolers run out and they're wanting water, that can create a tense situation between the incarcerated people and the staff member who they're wanting to refill that water or add ice to that water. So it can create those tense exchanges that can lead to a write-up. There are also certain access to those resources. So in talking about water coolers, what do you need to use a water cooler? You need a cup. That was a very common description in our surveys, was not having access to a cup. So you're given a small cup. And if you lose that cup, if you break that one cup, you might want to use a different item to get the water. You might, there were reports of, because the ice inside the water becomes so valuable when it's so hot, that folks will crack the top of the cooler and go in with their hands to grab the water. which also creates a tense exchange between incarcerated people because it's making it unsanitary or gross. There are certain items you can get from commissary to mitigate heat illness, supposedly. That may be fans, cooling towels, cooling T-shirts, electrolyte drinks, and if you have those in a place where you're not supposed to, or if you have not the correct number of those items you're supposed to have, you can get written up for a case. But I believe the most problematic is just the tense exchanges that in getting those resources creates between staff and inmates. So in wanting to get access to respite, you're talking about the education building or the infirmary. If you have units filled with hundreds, even thousands of people, how many individuals can have access to respite at one time? So how many incarcerated people were denied access to respite because it's full, or the officer may be having to try to make decisions about maybe this inmate is more sick than the other, and it puts this really complicated burden on them to have to decide who gets access to potentially life-saving resource. And that's incredibly stressful when incarcerated people can't get access to that resource. It's very tense and creates a lot of tense exchanges between staff and incarcerated people, which can lead to negative situations, obviously.
I've seen the individuals covet the position of being able to produce the ice, to work in the freezer areas to produce the different shapes of ice. And they are excited about that work because they get to work in a cool environment. And then the other group that transports the ice to the inmates. Have you done any research on the cost of actually having this production, ice production inside of our prisons?
Sure. I know that the maintenance of ice machines can be costly, and the purchase of coolers, endless numbers of coolers that may get dirty or stop working, has been costly. We do have references to specific numbers in our report on how much TDCJ has spent on having to repair broken ice machines. But imagine when we're talking about thousands of people demand on ice machines, on coolers. It's a constant breaking down, wear and tear on that infrastructure. Whereas if you were to be in a cooler environment, demand on that infrastructure would not be as intense, and then you would have less wear and tear, and those resources and infrastructure would certainly last a longer amount of time.
The impact on the infrastructure is great, and would love to get that information. One of the things, and this is my last question, that I'm concerned about as a former city manager, having the impact of having a prison in our city and the times that ambulance had to be called out. The cost for that was, the revenue that we generated as a municipality from the county because of the cost of sending public safety out, our paramedics out, was enormous for us. Now, when you look at that from a municipality perspective, it's dangerous because it ties up our folks at these facilities because of heat-related issues that could be mitigated if the desire was there.
Absolutely, and I think that brings up a fantastic point of just the number of illnesses and deaths that are related to heat are wildly, wildly underestimated. And I say because in that environment, you have that constant exposure to heat, and so that can degrade your health over time. So it could be heart attacks that may not have happened. It could be mental episodes that may not have happened. For example, when we talk about the impact of taking psychotropic medications for mental illness, that inhibits your body's ability to regulate temperature. And so we have anecdotal reports of folks who say they stop taking their medications in the summer because they don't want to die from heat illness. So they're not maybe taking the medications that they need to prevent them from having a suicidal ideation. We know that the number of suicide attempts are higher in the warmest months of the year. So you do have these likely medical emergencies that would decrease if they were, able to have access to a cooler environment. Our team at Texas A&M are going to be trying to look at that, at ambulance data and EMS call data, and what the demand, what kind of demand that puts onto local medical infrastructure.
All right, members, any other questions? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you guys being with us today. It's been very helpful.